All right, welcome everybody. My name is Scott Sauber, and today I'm going to be talking to you about avoiding the dark side and creating a healthy yet high-performing engineering organization. I have posted these slides up on my blog, which is just my first and last name, scottsauber.com. And if you want, you can follow me on Twitter. I'm just Scott Sauber there as well. So before we get into this, I just want to kind of level set on the target audience I had in mind when I made this talk. So really I'm targeting any of these people. So I'm targeting people from like management to tech leads to just software engineers on a team, and really just anyone who wants to improve their organization and get more done at the end of the day. So we're going to talk about all these different things. We're going to talk about why I'm valuing these 4 principles of autonomy, mastery, purpose, and community, and then how those fit into the series of questions I'm going to give you that you need to decide how to answer. So I'll give you my opinions, but at the end of the day, context matters. So some of my opinions might not be relevant for your particular context. And so my goals out of this today is just give you some ideas to help create a healthy and high-performing software engineering organization. But then also, again, the questions, in my opinion, are more important than the opinions that I'm about to give because, again, context matters. And I'm going to be doing some like broad strokes on a lot of this stuff. And a lot of it comes down to size of your company matters too, right? So if you only have like a team of 6 in your entire company and you're the software team of 6 for your entire company versus some companies that have, thousands of software engineers on the team, like some of these answers are going to be a little bit dependent on, the size. That's probably one of the biggest aspects of this. So a lot of my opinions, I try to generalize and be relevant no matter if you're a small shop or a large, Fortune 100 company. But some of these things you might like hear me talk about change advisory boards and be like, what the heck is that? If you're at a small company, and hopefully if you've never heard of a change advisory board, that's a very good thing. So again, size of the company matters a lot. So who am I? I'm the director of engineering at a company called Lean Techniques. We're a software consulting company based in Des Moines, Iowa, although we have people all over the U.S. We're roughly about 120 people. And we work with companies from Fortune 100 companies all the way down to startups and kind of everything in between. I'm also the co-organizer of the Iowa.NET user group, I'm a Microsoft MVP, I'm a friend of Redgate. I blog as well. And I've worked with dozens of clients, again, ranging from those Fortune 100 companies, down to mid-sized companies, down to startups. And I've kind of noticed some of these patterns crop up over and over and over again. And I would say at this point, when I get brought into a new client, I'm going to say 80 to 90% of the things I hear them say are things that I've heard before. There's always something a little bit different and different constraints that a client has that I haven't quite encountered before, but I'd say 80 to 90% of what I hear I've heard before somewhere else. Now, not every company has the exact same problems, so it's kind of like there's kind of like a bucket of problems, and 80 to 90% of what I hear are coming out of that bucket, but there might not be all of them that a company has. So that's kind of the genesis of this talk is like I've heard some of these things over and over and over again, and I'd like to help companies build better software at the end of the day because that's ultimately what I'm passionate about. My day-to-day varies from the client perspective. I do a lot of internal mentoring, but from the client perspective, I've talked from CEOs to middle managers to pair programming with engineers on teams and talking to stakeholders as well. So I kind of run the whole gambit, and I like it that way. So, some stuff I've heard clients say over the years. So, I'm curious if you've heard any of these at your organization or you experience any of these at your organization. So, I hear a lot of like, we spend all of our time firefighting and not actually adding new value. Or we don't get time to prioritize tech debt. Or we don't have great insights into our systems and like what our users are doing in our systems. Or our data is bad. Or this is one I've heard recently. We have one guy who knows everything, and if he leaves, we are screwed. We need to upskill our developers. Or the architects make all the decisions. Or I don't know what problem the solution is solving. That's what I hear a lot on the ground, like pair programming on teams. Some other things, we can't find anyone to hire. That's usually coming from like middle management or CIOs or things like that. And this is coming from like the other side of the house, the business, right? So the business doesn't think IT can deliver. But on the flip side, then IT says the business, always change their minds. That's why we can't deliver, right? Or I've heard a lot of like, this other team always gets in our way. Or we don't have time to do that, right? Or our estimates aren't reliable. Side note, should you even be estimating? Maybe that's a topic for another day. Or we only ship once every 6 months, which is not fast enough. Or yeah, we built this thing, but no one's actually using what we've built at all. And we don't really know why, right? So that's kind of a lot of quotes, and that's certainly not all of what I hear. But if any of those resonate with you, you might be like, okay, that's a lot of stuff. Like, what do I do now, right? So like, does any of that actually sound familiar? And if so, I don't know if this is any consolation or not, but everything I just went over is, at the end of the day, if you break it down far enough, a people problem. Very few of these things are actually technical problems. It's mostly a people problem at the end of the day. So you might be like, okay, it's a people problem. What do I do? Do I just, to go with the Star Wars theme, do I just force choke people until they do what I say, right? It's probably not, like, certainly, that can get results in the short term, but that's probably not the healthy aspect of this talk that I'm talking about. So there's some other techniques that we can use. And the good news is everything I just went over, I've seen it personally get fixed, or at least, even if it's not completely fixed, at least significantly improved. So if any of those sounded familiar, don't worry, there are solutions to some of those problems. But it can be a little overwhelming, right? So it's like, where do I start? Like, what do I do now? Like, okay, yes, some of those things sound familiar, but like, how do I go about solving them? So I want to introduce this book by Daniel Pink. Some of you may be familiar with it. And the idea behind this book, Drive, by Daniel Pink, is it's based on 40 plus years of psychology. And really what Drive explores is what motivates us, especially in this new world. And really it's kind of differentiating between intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation. And to kind of level set on what that is, intrinsic is where you're just inherently motivated without something external to you. So it's very internal focused, like you're just internally motivated. Versus extrinsic motivation is where somebody or something is motivating you external to yourself. So maybe somebody's offering a bonus, right? Or somebody's says, hey, if you do this, then this will be the reward at the end of the day. But what this Daniel Pink discovered is extrinsic motivation fails when it comes to knowledge work. Like, extrinsic motivation is really good when you're doing the same kinds of things over and over again. Like, I need to build these many widgets an hour with this amount of quality. And, if I hit these numbers, then, maybe I get a bonus or something like that. Like, that works pretty well for when you're doing the same kinds of things over and over again, but it fails in the long term with knowledge work. Like, certainly offering a bonus and things like that can motivate people in the short term, but really intrinsic motivation is what we're after, because it's internal focus. You don't have to keep replenishing the carrot and things like that. It's just something that's kind of innate in people. So Daniel Pink focuses on 3 things that motivate knowledge workers. Purpose, so like why are you doing what you're doing? Autonomy, meaning do you make the decisions for yourself and are self-directed, or do you have somebody telling you what to do? And mastery as well. So do you continually get better at your craft? Or, are you context switching a bunch or things of that nature? But also, I'm going to propose another one, and that is community. So and the reason why I add this is even if you know why you're working on what you're working on, you believe in the purpose, you have the autonomy to do what you need to do, and you're able to master the skills you need to master, if you don't like the people you're working with, you're probably going to be pretty drained and not motivated to work. So that's why I added community. Daniel Pink kind of talks about this when he talks about connectedness, but it's not a focus. He primarily focuses on purpose, autonomy, and mastery, but I'm going to add community in there. So here's a quote by Daniel Pink. In case you're still not convinced about extrinsic versus intrinsic motivation, he said, people use rewards expecting to gain the benefit of increasing another person's motivation and behavior, but in so doing, they often incur the unintentional and hidden costs of undermining that person's intrinsic motivation toward the activity. So I don't know if you've ever experienced this in your career. Let's say you get offered a bonus, like, hey, if you hit this deadline, you're going to get this bonus, right? Well, that can almost set a precedence or an expectation that, like, hitting any deadline now deserves some reward, right? So that's where extrinsic motivation kind of falls down, as you kind of always derive the value or the motivation for doing something towards this external thing versus it coming internally from within inside you. So we're going to talk about all these different things, purpose, autonomy, mastery, and community, and talk about questions that you need to ask your organizations, and then I will give my opinions on how you should answer some of those questions. So first off, let's talk about purpose, and like, what do I mean by purpose exactly? So this is where somebody has the desire to do something meaningful and important in their career. So this is where businesses really need to emphasize purpose to kind of rally around a particular cause that people can like focus on and rally around and kind of be the North Star and kind of the guiding light as well of like, okay, this is where we're going. This is the reason that we exist, and kind of rally behind that purpose. So if you've ever read Simon Sinek's Start With Why, he talks about this a lot, as well as Infinite Game, also by Simon Sinek. Both of those really good books, but he talks a lot about purpose as well, and the why, the cause that you have that's driving your organization. So it's not just Daniel Pink talking about these things. There are other authors as well talking about these things too. All right, so now that we know what purpose is, let's talk about questions that you need to ask your organization. So I'm going to start with question number 1. This is probably the most fundamental thing that you can ask your teams is, do they actually know what problem they're solving and why it's worth solving in the first place? If teams are just building features and they have no clue who their customers are, what problem they're solving, or anything like that, they are not going to be invested and intrinsically motivated to do their best work. That's just a plain out fact. And it's not just for like a particular feature of like, oh, why am I building this export to Excel button? But it's also like, why does their team even exist, right? It's more like meta, like what problems is that team solving? So you kind of have to go very basic of like, what is their purpose? Like, why was the team even formed in the first place? Like, what is the point of that team? And a lot of that, like if you're somebody who's on the team, I think this is something you need to, and you don't understand, I think this is where you need to go to your manager and be like, hey, I was just kind of curious, like, what is the purpose behind the team? Like, what problems are we solving? Like, I just want to hear your perspective on, like, what is the driving factor? Like, what is our North Star on this team? And that should be totally something that they're able to answer, because if they're not, I'd say everybody's just kind of shooting in the dark and hoping for the best. All right, so now let's talk about my opinions and how I would answer some of these questions. And even though I put question number 1 there, and there are multiple questions there, they're all kind of loosely related. So first off, when you're forming a team, give the team a clear problem space to work in. So figure out some value stream in your business and let the team own it at the end of the day. And then everybody should know how what they own impacts the business. So for instance, if I'm a payment, I'm creating, a payment web application, I should know, how much money is coming in through this thing. Like, how does that impact our business? Like, what cost savings is it getting us by, like, having it go through the website versus somebody mailing in a check? All those kinds of things. So, like, I should understand how what I'm doing impacts the bottom line of the company at the end of the day. And at smaller companies, ownership of these things is easy because you probably just own it all, right? So your team just kind of owns everything at the end of the day. We'll talk a little bit later about, like, teams versus working groups and some of those kinds of things. But at larger companies, this gets a lot harder because, like, how do you own things without stepping on toes, right? Because if you're at a large company, more than likely there's a lot of existing code in place. And sometimes these boundaries aren't quite clear cut, right? But again, you want somebody to own a problem space, not a solution. And this is where I see people get a lot of tripped up. Like, you want them to own a value stream, problem space, not a particular solution. So it's not, hey, you own the web application that lets customers make payments. Instead, it's you own the relationship with the customer after the sale, right? So when we're focused on problem spaces and value streams, then new solutions can emerge versus when we're focused only on the solution, then we're probably always just going to have a web application that lets customers make payments, right? We're never going to have, like, a mobile app or, any of these other things like, IVR to take payments over the phone automatically, some of those types of things. We're always just going to just have this web application versus when you say, hey, you own the relationship with the customer after the sale. So, they need to make payments on, like, let's say their car loan or mortgage or whatever the case may be. If you own that relationship with the customer after the sale, you can start thinking about other ways to help the customer after the sale. Like, hey, do you want to refinance? Do you want to refinance your loan, right? So then now it's not just like, oh, I'm the web app that takes payments. It's now I'm like the web app that's also marketing to the customer and generating new sales versus some other system or some other process doing all the sales generation, right? So that's where, like, customer experience starts to come in, and user experience starts to come in, where a customer has, like, the seamless integration and seamless experience across the board. So again, give the team a clear problem space to work in, a clear value stream, and let them own it from start to finish. We'll talk about what I mean by that here in a second. So, question number 2, how are we effectively measuring that we are solving that problem? So, if I go back to, hey, you own the relationship with the customer after the sale, like, what are the KPIs? Like, how are we measuring that, we're serving that customer after the sale? Like, what are the metrics that we care about, right? And, like, how do we know if we're making things better or worse for the customer at the end of the day? Is engagement up or down? Are we improving the outcomes for our customers, and are we making some business impact, right? Where we're, doing some cost savings and things like that. Like, how are we measuring that we're actually moving the needle or not? So this is where my second opinion comes in. Bake metrics into literally everything that you do in your applications. So anytime anybody does anything, capture that metric. So anytime they're clicking buttons, navigating to a page, whatever it is, you should be recording those metrics so you know how many times people are doing something. So if you click, hey, I want to download this document, I should be able to say like, okay, how many people downloaded which types of documents over the last month, and get some of those metrics to know like, okay, one, like how much cost savings have we had by like having electronic statements versus paper statements? And then also, what are our most popular documents? Like, what are people coming here to see? Like, should we make that more prominent? All that kind of stuff. And you should be able to trend it over a period of time. So something I see teams run into is they might like log it in their logging system, right? But then their logging system only keeps logs for the past 30 days, which is a problem when you want to trend over, multiple months or a year or whatever the case may be, right? So put it in some sort of durable storage that's more than, some length of time that's acceptable to your business. But this is where, the product side of the house, like product owners, product managers, or, if you don't have those, the business, which I hate saying the business because we're all in the same business, right? Like we're all in the same team. But they really need to share like, hey, what metrics are important to them? Like how do they know that we're solving the right problems, right? All of those kinds of things. And then start creating dashboards that visualize some of those important metrics. So for instance, if you're a site that takes payments, maybe number of payments made, or, if you're a retail shop, number of orders made, or size of order, or, total volume, or like all of those types of things, like margin, all of those kinds of things should be visualized in dashboards. And these should be visible to the team, like, back in the days when, working in person was more prevalent. I always like having dashboards just kind of sitting, next to, our Kanban board or whatever type of board that we have. So, people can see kind of what's going on. But like when engineers have this observability into what's going on in their systems, and you have these dashboards in place, then their motivation starts to skyrocket because now they actually know that people are using the stuff that they're building, right? Versus like, oh, I'm just going to chuck it over the wall and hope for the best. So I'm going to pause there. We're done talking about purpose. Those are only 3 questions. Well, there's a few more baked in there, but those are really all we're going to talk about with purpose today. So I just wanted to pause here for any questions. Obviously, I can't take them because it's a recording, but if you want, you can reach out to me on Twitter or shoot me an email as well. I'll be happy to take any of those. All right. Next, let's talk about autonomy. So I like this image because it's saying like, hey, go this way or that way. And it's like, nope, I'm going to actually go this way, right? So what do you mean by autonomy? Like what am I talking about here? So there's a lot of studies out there that self-direction actually increases engagement versus, just being an order taker. And again, we're talking about knowledge work here. There are certainly some industries and some types of people who prefer being told what to do, but generally speaking, software engineers are not those type of people, generally speaking. Certainly they want to kind of be informed of like what to help build and like what problems are out there and things like that. But being told exactly how to build it and stuff like that, I find a lot of good software engineers do not like that type of direction. They want to be able to choose how they solve the problem. But this does not mean there's no accountability. You still need some accountability of like, hey, any actions you take, at the end of the day, you're accountable for them. So like some people think like, oh, autonomy just means chaos, and that is not what it means. You should still have accountability to your team and to the broader organization as well. And some people think like, oh, well, I already empower my teams, right? And personally, I hate the term empowerment because it still assumes that the organization has this power they're bestowing upon you, and they're just like granting you or blessing you with that power, right? Whereas autonomy is like, hey, do what you need to do. I'm going to stay out of your way. If you ever need help, let me know, but I trust you to make decisions. That is way different than empowerment. It's saying like, oh yeah, we're allowing you to do these things versus autonomy. So it's a subtle difference, but that's why I don't like the word empowerment, because it's still like very command and control-y and like giving you power, and like I don't like the power dynamic that's there. And good software engineers want autonomy at the end of the day to solve the problem at hand. They don't want roadblocks. They don't want to deal with organizational red tape. They don't want to deal with, a bunch of dependencies where they got to talk to 4 different teams to do anything. They want to be able to ship their stuff and make a difference at the end of the day. All right, so question number 1 with autonomy. This is a big one, and this might be the most controversial one amongst some people, but do teams own their problem space from the database to the presentation layer, like a UI, or if you're just building an API, and almost everything in between? And we'll talk about what I mean by almost there and why that's got an asterisk. So my opinion, teams should own their own database, their own API, their own front end, their own pipelines, their own infrastructure as code. They should own all of that stuff themselves. There shouldn't be a separate team that manages the database. There shouldn't be a separate team doing the back end, a separate team doing the front end, separate team doing pipelines, separate team doing infrastructure as code. The teams should own some of those things. And this, ultimately, at the end of the day, minimizes your dependencies on external teams and opens the road to shipping to production, which, by the way, if your code is not in production, it is not worth anything, because if nobody's using it, it doesn't really matter at the end of the day. And this also results in a lot of choosing like platform as a service solutions over infrastructure as a service solutions, because teams don't want to manage their own virtual machines and things like that. They want to choose more platform as a service offerings where they just say, hey, here's my code, run it, here's how to scale it, all that kinds of things, all those kinds of things, and like the OS level and all those kinds of things are just managed for you, which at the end of the day reduces your maintenance burden on your companies. Now, this does not mean teams own literally everything. There might be, so if you're at a big company, there might be some cross-cutting solutions like identity providers, like an Okta, an Auth0, Keycloak, those kinds of things. That might be managed by another team or something like that, or some team kind of like leads the ownership of that. So that's where I had that asterisk. Some of these cross-cutting solutions might be owned by other teams, but generally speaking, you're not dealing with some of these cross-cutting solutions every day, and like making changes to like how you do security and things like that. Generally, once you kind of get things in place and secure, you don't really have to think about it too much again. So usually that's not something that you're dealing with on a day-to-day basis. Now, to do this, you need what's called T-shaped individuals. And so if you look at the shape of that letter T there, it's very long and deep in the center, but then, it's still shallow kind of towards the top, right? So what this represents is somebody might be deep in a particular area, like maybe they're deep on the back end or the front end or databases or pipelines or cloud or whatever the case may be, but they've got working knowledge, the kind of T across the top of the entire stack. And so that's where if you balance the teams and get these T-shaped individuals where somebody might be stronger in one particular area, those individuals can kind of like lead that particular area and help level up the rest of the team. So people get, wider deep parts of the T and kind of keep growing and growing in that way. And one anti-pattern I see a lot of teams do is they split up the teams into like front end and back end teams. And while this can be necessary in some rare cases, I find most cases this isn't needed and ultimately leads to inefficiencies, which ironically is one of the reasons why they create a front end and back end team in the first place, is to be more efficient, right? And so I find a lot more inefficiencies crop up in there. So for instance, it might result in more finger pointing. So when things go wrong, you might hear things like, oh, they didn't do their job, they didn't build what we need, whatever the case may be, or it's like their fault, right? So like you have this kind of split ownership, and when you have multiple teams owning a thing, nobody owns a thing, right? And then also, having front end and back end teams ultimately leads to handoffs at the end of the day. And if you're familiar with lean concepts in manufacturing, handoffs at the end of the day are often waste, right? And we want to minimize those handoffs as much as possible. And at the end of the day, those teams are going to locally optimize. So let's say the front end team gets some, needs some data from the back end team, but the back end team doesn't really provide it in the correct way. The front end team just be like, you know what, forget it. I'm not going to ask them to change it because then they got to like go through their backlog and we got to wait for them to deploy it. I'm just going to locally optimize and, put some extra logic in the front end that probably shouldn't live in the front end, should live in the back end. Or, it's like, oh, I'm just going to go actually, I kind of have the data I need over here and over here. So I'm just going to like make these multiple calls to get what I need versus like, yeah, there could be a more efficient way, but like I don't want to deal with a back end team having to do some of this stuff. So again, in my experience, what I've seen at companies, splitting up teams into front end and back end teams leads to inefficiencies. I'd rather have those T-shaped individuals that are deep in a particular area and, at least working knowledge in multiple areas. Now, this does not mean you don't have specialists in your companies, things like DBAs or cloud people, but those people might be more like consultants and helping, be consulted on an ad hoc basis or like helping to set good practices, things like that. But generally speaking, I don't like having, to make a change to the database, it has to go through like a completely different team. I don't think that is autonomous. And so like if you're not promoting autonomy, at the end of the day, what Daniel Pink says is you're demotivating your employees. All right, that was a long one and also probably the most controversial. Question number 2 for autonomy: do teams own the support of their own systems? Right? So do they support their own systems when they're out in production? So my opinion, there should not be a separate build team and a run team. Instead, because again, like handoffs leads to waste. So I think the team building the application should also be the team that has to run the application, because guess what? They're the ones that get pinged in the middle of the night, right? So this aligns some incentives and results in higher quality, because if the people building it are the also ones who get pinged in the middle of the night if something goes wrong, they're probably going to bake in some higher quality into there. So there's some aligned incentives versus when somebody else is getting woken up, there's no aligned incentives there. And this also promotes observability where, the engineers, if they're the ones who have to support it, they're going to bake in things like logs and metrics and telemetry into their application because, they're the ones who are going to have to support it at the end of the day. But this does mean they need access to troubleshoot, so access to logs, metrics, things of that nature. So I've seen some companies where, developers don't have access to certain logs and metrics and things of that nature. That really, to me, is another anti-pattern, and the team needs access to those things in order to do their job and troubleshoot. If you have sensitive things in your logs that people shouldn't see, you might want to reconsider whether or not you should be mixing your sensitive logs with like your insensitive logs where you're just kind of tracing through an application, or like, should you even be logging those things at all, right? So like you might want to, so if you have sensitive things in your logs that you're worried about people seeing, like maybe you should think about like, well, should we actually be logging those things or not? All right, let's talk about the DORA metrics. So Google did some research to figure out like what makes a high performing team. And after a lot of research, they came out with these 4 metrics that they call the DORA metrics. So the DORA metrics are deployment frequency, lead time for changes, change failure rate, and time to restore service. So talk about these real quick. Like, how often are you deploying to production, not just to like dev or test or staging or whatever? Like, how often are you deploying to production? If you're deploying once, once a month, once a week. That's maybe not frequent enough. So we had a client recently who was deploying once every 2 weeks at most. Sometimes it was once a month. And since we became involved, they're deploying anywhere from 5 to, I think the record that they had was like 32 times in a single day. So they're deploying to production all the time. And another thing, lead time for changes. So this is like, hey, once you start working on some changes, like how long does it take for it to get out the door and into production? So, again, if we want to minimize that time, so it's measured in, hours or days and not weeks or months or, heaven forbid, even years, which I have seen that before, where products have not been shipped for over a decade and they're still working on them. So change failure rate is the third one. And so this is like, hey, let's say you make 100 changes in a given week. What percentage of those had a failure, had a regression? Is it 1%? Hopefully it's somewhere around 1% and not much higher than that, and not like into the double digits, because that's not a good sign whatsoever. And then when you do have some of these failures, some of these bugs come through, because ultimately bugs are inevitable. Some amount of bugs, we just want to be able to minimize those as much as possible. So like how quickly does it take you to restore your service and fix that bug? So those 4 metrics: deployment frequency, lead time for changes, change failure rate, and time to restore service, are the 4 metrics Google identified on how you can determine if a team is high performant. You can actually go to dora.dev/quickcheck and plug in your numbers for how often you're deploying, what's your lead time for changes, all that kind of stuff, and it will tell you how you rate compared to the rest of the industry. We'll talk about Dora metrics a little bit later as well. We're going to talk about it here in a second, but we'll talk about it a little bit deeper later in the talk as well. So with that in mind, when it comes to autonomy, like our team's allowed to push changes to production without external approval from outside the team. So not necessarily like, when I say external, not like outside the organization, but just outside the team. So my opinion is ownership means ownership, including when to push to production. This also aligns incentives, because when the team who owns pushing to production also owns the support of the systems, again, they're going to bake in some higher quality versus, somebody else deciding when they deploy to production. And when you don't have ownership to deploy to production, that means 3 of the 4 Dora metrics increases automatically. So it increases your lead time of how quickly you get a change out. It reduces your deployment frequency, because you're relying on a third party outside of your team, and it increases restore time, because again, you're relying on somebody else outside of the team to do the work versus that capability being part of the team. And according to a book called Accelerate, it had no meaningful impact on change failure rates by having some of these change advisory boards, or moving it to like, a manager or something to actually push the button for the team to push it to production. So that book is called Accelerate by Gene Kim, Jez Humble, and Nicole Forsgren. And there's some links here. Change advisory boards don't work. And then code freezes don't work as well. So I'll pause here for a second so you can grab those links in case you are interested. So if you have change advisory boards at your company, or you do code freezes, read those links to figure out why you're probably not getting the results you're intending by having some of those things. All right, autonomy question number 4. Are teams allowed to make the best decisions for their particular space? So this is very similar to the previous one, but if you have external decision makers for local problems, that shouldn't exist. So that should be internal to the team. So what I mean by that is like, if it's just a day-to-day problem of like, hey, how do I do this? Or like, there's this decision point here of like, we go down this direction for the product or this direction. Like, those small decisions should not require an external decision maker. Now, if you're talking like, hey, we're currently in Azure and we're going to switch to AWS, yeah, that might be, outside of your team scope, and maybe you want to get some other people involved. But I've seen teams where they have to go to an external decision maker outside of their team for every little question. So if you have people outside of the team like architects or UI UX or even product, and they're not on the team, I'd rather embed those people on the team and have them just be part of the team. So have a UX person dedicated to that team. Have an architect just, be a tech lead essentially and be part of the team. As well as I believe architects should code because that's how they get feedback on their decisions, right? So like if they're saying, hey, we need to use this pattern or this tool or something like that, the way that they know the best way for them to get feedback on their decision is to actually implement it themselves and see how the system gets more complex or simpler to maintain based on their decisions. And again, on big decisions, it's okay to collaborate, even external to your team, but at the very least, internal to your team. So like, if you're going to switch out your data access library, that's probably something you want to talk with the team first before you just go ahead and do it by yourself or with your, like a pair. You should always like get everybody involved and start discussing trade-offs. All right, so those are my 4 questions around autonomy. Again, if you have any questions around that, there's my contact info. But now we're going to move on to mastery, which is one of the beefier topics that we're going to talk about here. So let's talk about mastery. Question number 1 of like, what training opportunities are provided by the organization? So you should be sending your people to conferences because conferences is where you see what other cool things people are doing. And I can't tell you how many times, like, just getting out of your comfort zone, like you might be living in your bubble and then you go to a conference and kind of opens your world to like new patterns, new ideas, new libraries, all these kinds of things that might spur some ideas inside your head. So probably don't, considering you're at a virtual conference right now, probably don't have to convince you of that. But also I think in-person conferences have a lot of value as well. Just talking to other people, getting to meet people in the industry, like, getting to meet people you follow at, big companies and stuff like that, and getting to hear what they're talking about, I think has a lot of value as well. And then make space for them to go to like local user groups, which by the way is free. So that doesn't cost any money whatsoever. As well as like a lot of user groups, like for instance, the Iowa.NET user group that I help run, about half or 2/3 of our events are virtual. So like since COVID happened, a lot of user groups went virtual or like have hybrid events now. So you don't even have to stay local. You can even go to some of these virtual user groups and go to meetup.com and search for certain topics. Or you can have like asynchronous training where you can kind of like do it at your own pace with things like Pluralsight. Or create book clubs, or, if you want to get Azure or AWS certified, creating study groups to say like, hey, let's all go through this course together. Maybe we're going to watch, 2 modules a week and then kind of get together to talk about like what we learned, any questions people had, those kinds of things. Or like with book clubs, saying like, hey, we're going to read this book. Like maybe you'll read Drive, for instance, and say like, hey, we're going to read 2 chapters a week and kind of get together to talk about what we read and get our thoughts, right? As well as doing things like tech leveling. So like getting multiple teams involved and saying like, hey, every 2 weeks for an hour, we're going to get together and, each team is going to go around and talk about what it is that they're working on. Maybe talk about, challenges that they're running into to see if like, hey, is anybody else running into these challenges, or like successes that they've had. Maybe you can get teams to share, what cool things that they're working on or patterns or whatever the case may be. Or it could be intra-team, so it could just be inside of your team. You do some of these tech levelings as well. And I hear, this, I can't remember where I heard this kind of answer to this question, but I've heard this question from clients before of like, well, yeah, but like, I don't want to spend thousands and thousands of dollars on a person and train them because like, what happens if we train them and they leave, right? But think about the alternative. Like, what happens if you don't train them and they don't leave, right? They're probably not going to be as good as if you did train them, right? So at the end of the day, if they're leaving, that's an indicator that maybe there's something you should change about your company. Not always, right? Like, but if you have this problem where you keep training up people and then they leave, that might be a smell that something is going on, and maybe they don't have some autonomy, mastery, purpose, community going on in their organization. There's some gap there. All right, question number 2. How are we growing others in our day-to-day work? So I have an opinion that a tech lead's goal should be to work themselves out of a job. And what I mean by that is not have somebody who's the designated tech lead. So get some other people involved and don't be a superhero. And one little tip for this is like when somebody comes asking for permission, ask them why do they need your permission, right? So I've had this before where somebody came to me and was like, hey, I'm dealing with this problem at a client. I really think we should be doing some regular dojo style trainings where we just do like some little like hackathon things like once a week for an hour. And I'm like, cool. So you think they need that? Yep. Okay, cool. What are you waiting for? Like, are you asking my permission? Like, you're closer to this. Like this, I trust you. Like to make your own decisions. Like you don't need to ask me for permission to do it. Just go propose it and start doing it, right? And then that person, went and proposed it and, got the buy-in of the team that they're working with. And, they are still doing those dojos to this day. So that's kind of like a tip to like help. I know we're talking about mastery here, but like this is kind of more of an autonomy one too. Of like when somebody comes asking for permission, ask them, why are you asking me? Like if you think it's the right thing to do, just go do it. Because that can flip some of the power dynamic and promote and illustrate autonomy. So again, be okay giving teams the autonomy. Again, not empowerment, like we talked about before. And make sure you're doing some sort of continuous mentoring. So in my opinion, the fastest way to mentor somebody and develop somebody is through pair programming, where you're working with them every day, most of the day, because you get to learn, how different people work. So you learn different like keyboard shortcuts or workflows or things like that. But then also you're continually leveling them up, telling them how you're thinking and stuff like that. But at a minimum, checking, like if you're a tech lead, checking in with your team regularly, like doing one-on-ones, things like that, making sure everybody's kind of on the same page and you like have that pulse of the team. All right, question number 3. How often do engineers switch between multiple tech stacks that do the same type of thing? So in general, I'm going to say pick a stack and go with it. So I've seen some teams where, they've got some Node, they've got some Java, they've got some Scala, they got some Kotlin, they might have some C#. Like, at the end of the day, don't require the team to learn multiple backend languages or front-end languages or multiple frameworks. Like, pick one and just go with it and start slowly moving everything to it if you're in this situation today and you need to get out of it. And when you're choosing to pivot, so let's say your team knows a lot of, let's say C# today, and you want to pivot to Node on the back end, you need to make sure the benefits of pivoting outweigh the extreme cost of basically taking all of that existing knowledge that you have on your team, that learning, that experience in that other tech, and basically throwing it away and throwing it in the dumpster, right? And kind of starting over in a new tech stack. So honestly, I think a lot of times, as long as you're in one of those big languages, C#, Java, JavaScript, Python, one of those kinds of languages. Like obviously there's others that I'm just forgetting, but like, don't choose something like super esoteric that's like hard to hire for, hard to find people, all that kind of stuff. Like if you're on one of the mainstream languages, like you're fine. You're going to find people for those different languages that I mentioned, right? So again, just like there's definitely cases where you need to pivot, but just make sure that the benefits of doing so outweigh throwing away all of that knowledge, because I think that's something that we don't think about quite enough. All right, so these are a few different questions, but like the number 4, they're kind of loosely all related. Like how many different tools do engineers have to learn to do their job effectively? Like how simple is our tech stack? How quickly does it take a new person to get up to speed? That's actually like a metric that I think we don't, like it's kind of hard to measure, but like if you think about it, like how long does it take, let's say a senior person, like somebody who really knows JavaScript, and you're an all JavaScript team, how long does it take them to get up to speed on your tech stack? Like, is that measured in hours, days, weeks, months, years? And like, how are we lowering that barrier to entry to like reduce that number down? And a lot of that comes down to like simplifying things, consolidating tools, that kind of thing. So in general, if you can pick tools that check multiple boxes, so for instance, like GitHub, for instance, while GitHub's not perfect, it provides a lot of these things out of the box, like source control, CI/CD, package management, dependency scanning, and more, versus like picking one tool that just does source control, another tool that just does CI, and another tool that just does CD, and another tool that just does package management. You gotta like stitch all these things together. Like if you pick tools that check multiple boxes, you get those free integration points for you. As well as leverage your cloud services. So if you're in Azure and you need secrets management, you should probably be using Azure Key Vault, right? Like the cost of pulling in like a HashiCorp vault, for instance, is going to be extremely high, because like Azure Key Vault, for instance, has like access policy integration with different services like Azure App Services. And to replicate that similar thing in HashiCorp Vault, you're just going to be spending a lot of time doing that. So if you're in a cloud, just start leveraging a lot of their services that they offer. And you probably shouldn't worry about multi-cloud, right? Because like if you say like, oh, we're going to be in AWS and Azure and GCP, like that's a lot for people to know, right? And those are not created equal. So maybe you can worry about like multi-region instead of multi-cloud. Like start with multi-region before you start worrying about multi-cloud. And then again, as we talked about earlier, prefer platform as a service over infrastructure as a service, so you don't have to manage, OS updates and things like that. And then I see like, not to bag on Kubernetes, because Kubernetes is certainly a good tool, but like, do you actually need Kubernetes, right? Like there's a trade-off to doing Kubernetes. You have to know about like services and replica sets and Helm charts and readiness probes, liveness probes, like all these different concepts that I see teams that adopt Kubernetes just struggle with and kind of stub their toe on over and over and over again. And honestly, like compute is the easiest thing to move. So if you're just using Kubernetes to like host your web APIs and stuff like that, that compute is the easiest thing to move on the planet to another cloud. So like the argument about, oh, I can take my Kubernetes cluster and move it over here, like never really resonated with me too much, except in like very large scenarios. But like what's harder to move is some services. Like, so if you have AWS SQS, does not have the same feature set as Azure Service Bus, and which does not have the same feature set as GCP PubSub, right? So you might be depending on features like ordering and stuff like that of your messages that don't exist in one of these other services. So that's where people kind of start thinking like about moving from cloud to cloud, and compute is going to be by far the easiest thing to move. It's the services that are going to be the harder stuff to move. All right, number 5. with mastery. How are we continuously getting better at the work that we're doing? So, like, are we doing some sort of retrospective where we're saying, like, hey, how did the last week or 2 weeks go, right? In my opinion, I like retros every week, personally, but are we doing other Kaizen events? And they're like, okay, we're doing retros, but, like, are they actually honest and effective? Like, do we have trust on the team? And if we don't, one of the ways to build that trust is through leaders showing vulnerability themselves. So if you want to start building trust on a team, leaders have to be the ones to kind of kick that off and, build that trust on the team. Then that'll trickle down to the rest of the team. As well as, like, if we're worried about improving the work, we can carve out time for tech debt, or sometimes 20% time, where, hey, 20% of our time is going to be spent improving the work. And, like, I think we all know that tech debt's, like, the first thing that gets cut under a time crunch. So one way, or like, or a new feature coming in, like, oh, we want this new feature. So just like, we'll do tech debt next week or next sprint. But this week we're going to prioritize some features. So this is where, like, it's up to leaders. Like, when you're doing like weekly or bi-weekly demos of the software, the first question they should ask is, how did we get better at the work today? Like, what tech debt did we improve? Because if the team knows that their leader or their stakeholder is asking that question the very first time in each demo, they're not going to cut that tech debt time. Like, the product owner is not going to deprioritize it because they know that it's important to the stakeholders. So this is where we talk to a lot of stakeholders and managers to talk about, like, hey, you need to be, prioritizing this and put a priority on this. And that's one way that you can do it, is have it be the very first thing that gets asked in a demo. And also consider hackathons. So, like, if you do like a 1-2 day, 1 week hackathon of, like, hey, software engineers, you get to decide 100% what you build. You don't have product person or business person kind of help, steering you. You just totally steer yourself. A lot of times what I see is they'll build tools that actually end up helping the business, right? So, and this also helps promote autonomy too. So, like, not only are they improving themselves in the work, but they're also gaining autonomy as well. All right, question number 6. So now we're going to talk about some DORA metrics here, where it's all about improving the DORA metrics. So how do we reduce change failure rate? So you should have a CI/CD pipeline to automatically build and automatically deploy your applications. You should be writing automated tests. You should be breaking down knowledge silos. So you can do this with techniques like pair programming, or a concept called least qualified implementer, where this can be a pair programming technique where you take what's technically like the least qualified person, like somebody who's never worked on a system before, and you say, okay, you're going to work on this story and you're going to pair with somebody who does have a lot of knowledge, but you're going to be the primary driver of this. The other person's just going to kind of guide you and tell you where to look, where to go, answer any questions, all that kind of stuff. Because at the end of the day, people want to be able to go on vacation and not worry about something breaking. Like, if you have a team of people who kind of all understand each other's work, like, you can go on vacation, not worry about it. Or you can, as a manager, not worry about, like, oh, if we lose this person, we're screwed, right? Like that quote that we heard early on. You're not in that situation. So you should have health checks of your system, something that spins up and says, like, hey, am I healthy? Can I actually boot my application, hit my dependencies that I need to, and things like that? Because these health checks can then be used to, like, decide when you say, hey, promote to production, you promote to production, and the health checks fail, it stops that deployment. It doesn't continue on, and, kind of keeps the old version running there as well. So that's how we reduce change failure rate. So how do we reduce our lead time for changes? So are we picking frameworks, tools, libraries, patterns that make things easy to change? Don't pick esoteric ones. Like, I should be able to Google something and get tons of hits, right? And if you don't have a good community, like if I Google an error in your framework, your tool, your library, and I get very few hits, it's probably a sign that I picked the wrong framework or tool or library, because at the end of the day, a lot of these things should have a lot of documentation, a lot of Stack Overflow, posts, GitHub issues, all that kind of stuff by now. And then if you can architect your systems to be more vertically sliced instead of horizontally sliced. So when you have more vertically sliced architectures, usually you're more focused on just the use cases of things. So you might be doing things like feature folders where you're grouping things by the feature it's in instead of horizontally slicing things by like the type or the responsibility that something has, like controllers, models, views, those kinds of things, right? So I would rather prefer organizing things by vertical slices, such as the features you're working on, like, payments or customers or things like that, things that describe what it is that the system does. And centralize your logic. So anytime you make a change, if I have to go touch 8 different things, that's probably a sign that something is not centralized properly. And then write automated tests around this stuff. And then identify, because ultimately at the end of the day, that's going to help your lead time for changes as well, because you'll catch things earlier if you're writing tests earlier in the process versus if you're relying like on a manual QA or something to catch all of your bugs. And then identify some workstream bottlenecks that you have and try to remove them, which might require reorg or at least improve them. So like if you're in a situation where you have a front-end team and a back-end team, maybe you can't, maybe you're not in a position to like easily influence that to say like, hey, we should become one team, right? Maybe that's something you start dripping on, but in the meantime, you can say like, hey, would you be open to taking pull requests to contribute to your code base to add a new field to an endpoint or change the behavior or something like that? Generally speaking, that's a good stepping stone and can honestly even start opening the door to combining the teams as well. All right, how are we employing deployment frequency? So can we do continuous deployment instead of continuous delivery? So what I mean by that is if the build is green, you should be pushing to production. And if you're not pushing to production, you should ask yourself, okay, why am I not pushing to production? Is there something I want to manually validate in an environment? And if there is, maybe that's an automated test that we can write instead of manually verifying that. And then let's keep asking ourselves that question of build's green, what's making me not confident to push to production, right? So are you missing tests or health checks, or you can have some automated rollbacks and things like that, or stopping promotion if it fails a health check. Also, stop doing environment branches or really any long-running branches in general, because those are going to slow down your deployment frequency as well. So instead, do more of a trunk-based development type of flow where, yeah, sure, you might have a short-lived feature branch, but you're continuously integrating that into the main branch. And then using things like feature toggles, which is just a fancy word for an if statement, to say hey, this feature is toggled on in my lower environments, but not production, right? So then when you want to actually flip it on for production, you just flip a flag at the end of the day. So it can kind of decouple deployments from releases. So you can release software without deploying a brand new version. And continuous integration is something you do, not something you have. So some people think it's something they have because it's it's a CI server, it's a build server, right? But continuous integration is a practice, not a build server. It's something where you're continuously integrating your code with other people's code. So that's a mindset that I wanted to get you in of am I continuously integrating my code to prevent merge conflicts? Get feedback sooner of am I down the right path? All that kind of stuff. All right, question number 9, the last DORA metric. So how do we reduce time to restore service? So this requires a fast pipeline. So anytime a pipeline takes more than 15 minutes to deploy to production, I immediately start getting a little antsy of okay, are there slow tests? Why are those tests slow? Can we improve those? Are the build times slow? Like, why are the build times slow? Are we doing something goofy? I've seen pipelines that were like 30 minutes, and come to find out that when we were running code coverage, we were actually running code coverage against all of the JavaScript packages that we had in our node modules, right? So then we had to explicitly say, hey, ignore node modules, and then suddenly, that shaved off like 20 minutes from the build pipeline. So kind of investigating why your build pipeline's slow, because again, I want to get to production in less than 15 minutes. But you also have to be proactively notified of any exceptions that come through in your application. So you shouldn't be relying on users to report issues. You should be able to be notified when things like that happen, and then handle those yourself. Also, like dashboards showing metrics. So after you deploy, if like response times go through the roof, you should be notified of that as well. And at the end of the day, this is talking about needing good observability of your system, as well as good test environments to like reproduce errors and things like that, good test data, all that kind of stuff. So, any questions about mastery? So I'll let you think about that for a second while I take a drink before we talk about our last topic, which is community. All right, let's talk about community. So community, for the first question on community that I like to ask is, do we actually have a team or a working group of individuals, like a loose working group of individuals? So what I mean by that, in the litmus test you can ask yourself is, anyone on the team should be able to pick up any story and work on it. If somebody on the team cannot do that, then you probably have a loose working group of individuals and not an actual team. And also, you probably have some knowledge silos. So if somebody is the only person who knows, AWS, and they're the only person who can do the infrastructure as code stuff, then you have a knowledge silo, and you should be working to break down that knowledge silo. So when I say get rid of them here, I don't mean get rid of the person, just get rid of the knowledge silo. And if you're doing pair programming, you should avoid what I've heard affectionately called as pairages. So, do Tom and Billy always end up pairing together? Well, then maybe they need to break it up, because ultimately that's just a knowledge silo with two people. And really you want to do more balanced pairing, where you're not overly unbalanced to one person or another. So question number 2, how do teams collaborate with one another? So if you're in a bigger organization where there's multiple teams, how do they collaborate? So we should not be locking down repos by default. By default, they should be open to the internal public, meaning inside of your company. So this promotes something called inner source. So we're all familiar with open source, where open source is like, hey, anybody in the world can look at the code. Inner source is not something I made up. If you Google it, it's a real thing. This is where anybody inside your company can see the code base. And so this allows teams to collaborate and share code easily, because they can, if somebody says, hey, I'm struggling with this thing. Have you guys ever done this before? They can just be like, oh yeah, here, let me link you to the GitHub file that, solves this problem. So you can share code and collaborate really easily. As well as if you don't have teams that communicate, there can sometimes be this tension of I don't even know what that other team does, right? What does that other team even do, right? But if you have open repos by default, you can just go look, right? And so it helps break down some of that tension and gives more transparency of what are the other teams working on. And you can also stumble upon things of oh, that's cool. We could actually use that, right? That's happened to us before, where I've been working with a team and we just stumbled upon a GitHub action that somebody created from a whole nother team. And so we reached out to them. We're like, hey, we're going to use this thing. Any issues with us doing it? And they're like, nope, go ahead and use it. And, that was something that would have never happened if we weren't able to just like search the GitHub organization for, what it is that we were looking for. As well as, do you have like cross-team tech levelings, again, where, multiple teams are sharing what they're working on, their challenges, their successes? Like, are you doing lean coffees of like, hey, let's just, have people pick topics that they want to talk about, and, we kind of have a roundtable discussion about these. Or are they doing presentations where it's like, okay, this is the actual formal presentation. Let me level set you on like, REST best practices or GraphQL or, this Azure service or whatever the case may be. Those are things that you can do across multiple teams. And I also like, if you have hackathons, forcing some cross-pollination, at least on some interval, maybe not every single hackathon, but like, 2 engineers from 2 different teams have to be like on the same team working on this particular hackathon, because that will help build relationships and help keep those 2 teams connected if you have some of that cross-pollination going on. Again, it doesn't have to be through hackathons. It could be through something else, but just kind of building those relationships, I think, is a big deal. And question number 3, how are we attracting the best talent? And I really like this phrase, talent attracts talent. And what I mean by that is oftentimes people want to work with other talented people, right? Occasionally you have people who want to be like the sole big fish in a small pond, and they want to be the superhero and stuff like that. But most people want to work with other talented people. And a lot of talented people know other talented people, right? So that's what I mean by talent attracts talent, is if you have talented people, try and leverage those people to attract talent. Bring them in interviews. Like, even if they don't know other talented people, bring them in interviews and kind of let them like talk and showcase what they know, like how they talk about the company, that kind of thing. And I see this mistake happen too, of like, oh, we're going to take a bunch of these senior engineers and just spread them all out. And, we're only going to have a single senior engineer on a team per team. And what I've seen is that's just a recipe for burnout or superhero syndrome or knowledge silos or all 3, where, somebody gets burnout, or they feel like they have to be the superhero, or they get like, a lot of adrenaline from being the superhero, so that just kind of self-perpetuates itself, and then they end up having a lot of knowledge silos as well. So if you can put multiple senior engineers on a team, that will help balance out some of those things. And pay needs to be in line at least with like local markets. So you need to be like, especially now where people can get a job, there's lots more remote jobs than there ever was before. Your pay needs to be at least in line with your local markets. Because if you're not in line with local markets, like other companies in your local markets are going to be poaching your talent, but you're also competing again with, remote companies as well. So if you're not in line with local markets, you're going to have a tough time finding talented people, and then you'll have a tough time attracting other talented people, and that kind of self-perpetuates itself. And product needs a vision to rally behind at the end of the day. So, like, that's also a way to attract talent, is you need some vision that people can really rally behind. I really like single word statements, or single word or single sentence statements around, what it is that we're rallying behind, right? So maybe it's like, we are consolidating systems or something like that, like something that's like consolidation or, refresh or rebrand or, reinvigorate, something that like some single word or single sentence that, everybody kind of uses that term when they talk about a particular initiative or particular product. All right. And that is all I have for community. And we are actually at the end of the talk as well. So the takeaways I hope you got out of this is, hopefully you got a awareness to these 4 principles that kind of like are your guiding lights of like how you can create a better engineering organization of autonomy, mastery, purpose, and community. So like everything that you do, kind of keep these 4 concepts in mind of like, okay, am I promoting autonomy, mastery, purpose, community? Which one of these am I promoting, or am I promoting multiples of these? As well as hopefully I gave you some ideas to take back to your organization to start proposing or implementing. But again, my opinions, I think, are less valuable than the questions because, again, a lot of my opinions are brushing with very broad strokes. Some things may or may not apply. So hopefully the questions were actually more valuable than the actual opinions. So if you have any questions, again, there's my contact information. Feel free to shoot me an email, send me a tweet, or if you want these slides, I'm also posting them up on my blog at scottsauber.com. So with that, thanks for coming and hope it was useful. Thanks, everybody.